Welcome everybody. My name's Stuart Johnston from Energy Networks Australia, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar regarding the Energy Networks Australia project to develop a suite of national network guidelines. Today's webinar, first of all, I'll just go through how today's webinar will work, and that I'll introduce the project, and then I'll pass over to Melanie Corner from Cutler Merce, who we've commissioned to assist us in delivering this project, who will go through the project design. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you're invited to write your messages in the comments box of the, which is to the side, and at the end of the presentation, myself and Melanie will endeavour to answer each of those questions. However, if we run out of time with the period we've got for the webinar today, any outstanding questions we'll have will be answered and put on our website within the next 2 or 3 days. So I'd like to just introduce this piece of work. This is a very important piece of work that's come out of numerous pieces of studies that have actually gone on previously, and was also a major finding of the electricity network transformation roadmap, where it was actually identified that there were a whole lot of consternation and issues around how proponents at all levels of the system, from the low V system all the way up to the HV system, were having issues around connecting DER to the networks. Some of those issues that were actually identified were they were too onerous and not achieving the right balance. There was inconsistency across the networks, particularly for some of the larger scale proponents, where they had to working with a number of different networks, and they were finding that the requirements were not the same, or how they're actually being asked to actually do fill those requirements was not exactly the same. And there's also a lack of clarity in respect to some of the technical and documentation required for the to actually undertake that work. So that ended up becoming one of the key milestones and one of the key actions that came out of the roadmap. And so when we actually went through after the completion and publication of the roadmap earlier this year, it was identified as one of the key flagship programs that we wanted to run as a priority for the industry to actually take forward. So those milestones, we actually had 45 milestones and 158 actions, and they've sort of been garnered down into these 11 flagship projects. We've got a whole section around grid orchestration and architecture and procurement models. We've got this whole section around policy priorities, but the DER connection guidelines is actually one of these flagship programs, which is around the issues we identified as enablers for that transformation and getting that right. This project was then taken back to our members and was actually approved and funded, is being fully funded by the ENA membership to actually undertake this work. However, because it is such a high-profile issue, and because there's a lot of interest in this, we want to make sure we're actually getting it right. The whole idea is actually to do this work in collaboration with all of the key stakeholders that are out there, and get their feedback, and making sure that we're actually working very closely with all those key stakeholders. For example, all of the members of the Clean Energy Council, but also different government jurisdictions, the federal government, etc., etc. I'll hold it there. What I'm going to do now is introduce Melanie Corner she's actually being the project manager for this out of Cutler Merce. And she's had a long association with actually doing this work. She was actually quite instrumental in some of the work, the initial work that was done for the Clean Energy Council's Future-Proofing the Australian Distribution Industry project that was actually completed in 2015, which was the forerunner to what we were looking at in the roadmap. And we're very happy to have her assist us in actually delivering this piece of work. Thanks, Mel.
Okay, thank you, Stuart, and thank you everyone for attending. My name is Melanie Turner. I'm a principal consultant at Cutler Mertz, and as Stuart said, we've been engaged to prepare these national network connection guidelines. I guess we're right at the start of this project, so this webinar today is really intended to give you a sense of what we're setting out to achieve and the opportunities that you'll have along the way to engage in what really needs to be a collaborative effort across the industry, including networks, proponents, government and policymakers alike. So I'm really grateful you can attend and looking for your feedback across the entire project. So what are the National Network Connection Guidelines? So our brief is really overall to prepare a set of guidelines which streamline the technical requirements for all of the technical requirements to connect generators, and we mean all types of generators from the largest to the smallest to Australia's electricity network, so from the west coast to the east coast. The overall aims of the guideline is to really respond to the studies which are over, I guess, since back to early to 2013, I think, was the first study that identified that there is a need for the technical requirements for connection to Australia's networks to be streamlined. So that's the primary aim. And then I guess coming out of the network transformation roadmap, we've identified that that these technical requirements really should be future-proof, that we have to look forward to how the distributed energy resources in particular can participate in the existing and emerging energy markets. And so we are looking to understand how the technical requirements can feed into the processes that are underway in other areas. And also the technical requirements provide for system strength and security, and this is really coming out of the Finkel review, or making sure we meet the objectives or some of the recommendations that came through there around how technical requirements for connection, particularly at the larger scale, must provide for system strength and security. So I wanted to touch briefly on the history of these technical requirements, because it really has been a long time coming. So back in 2013, there was the federal government commissioned a study by AECOM which set out that there was a case to produce streamlined technical standards across distribution networks. Then there was a rule change request that came in 2014 by the Clean Energy Council, and part of that was to request that these technical requirements were set through that process. The rule change didn't go so far as setting the technical requirements, but required NSCs at that stage to produce information packs to explain what the technical requirements were and how they came up with them. Then a series of other rule changes around embedded generation, including describing the different processes under Chapter 5 and Chapter 5A of the rules, for those of you that are familiar with them, in terms of how embedded generators connect. So it's really process focused rather than technical itself. Then the CEC study that Stuart spoke about, this was putting forward the case of engaging with network service providers around what these technical requirements should look like. Should they be an Australian standard? Should they be a voluntary standard? What would give us the best possible chances of these technical standards being agreed to across all MSPs? And that study recommended that a voluntary standard produced in collaboration of ENA and the Clean Energy Council was produced. I guess a key milestone was also the revision of AS 4777 earlier this year, which changed the definition of micro-embedded generators up to 200 kilowatts, which really helped to streamline some of the requirements for grid connection around inverter-based systems up to that size. Then we have the energy network transformation itself, the Finkel review, and I guess that's all culminating in why we're here today in terms of finally getting these guidelines prepared. So a set of guidelines that will set out the technical requirements for connection of generators to the networks at all scales, and that's where we are today, finally, hopefully getting the job done. Just a bit of a few definitions for those of you who aren't familiar, because we'll be referring to these a little bit, not just today, but throughout the project. The types of connections that we'll be talking about, the basic connections, and these are the definitions that are under the National Electricity Rules. The basic connections are really the smallest types of connections at low voltage, which are relatively straightforward for the network service providers to process inverter-based micro-embedded generation. There's another type of connection called a standard connection, and this is where they get sort of larger than those smaller connections and may potentially require more bespoke technical requirements. The term microembedded generator we'll also use, and that refers to any generator that's covered by AS4777 that's connected to a distribution network, so a inverter-based technology up to 200 kilowatts. Non-registered is sort of everything else greater than 200 kilowatts that doesn't fit into those other definitions, and that's really where some of the studies have found that there's a lot of inconsistency potentially in some of the technical requirements that networks set. It's that sort of middle ground before you get to the 5 megawatts and above that have to be registered with AEMO, that middle ground which don't fit into the basic type definitions and that may create more of an impact on the network. That's where there, I guess historically in some of the other studies have suggested that there is less clarity and more ambiguity in terms of what the technical requirements might be. And then the registered connections, the ones that are required to be registered with AEMO, typically 5 megawatts or greater. So the documents that we are going to be producing, at a minimum, there will be 2 documents, but likely more. The first document is a framework and principles guideline, and that one we're aiming to produce it by early next year, and that will set out the scope and the structure of the guidelines that we are going to produce. So how many, what technologies they cover, those sorts of things. And then the technical guidelines themselves, which we will, as much as possible, go into specifying the technical requirements for each connection type. It's still yet to be decided in terms of how detailed we are able to go, because one of the highest priorities of this project is to achieve consensus across all of the network service providers, and so there will be a bit of I guess balance in making sure that we want to provide technical specificity, but we also want to make sure we achieve consensus across the networks, and that's probably one of our biggest challenges in doing that. The framework and principles guidelines, so this is the one due early next year. The questions that I have here, these are the questions that the framework and principles guidelines should answer. So we will be specifying in the framework and principles guidelines what types of connections the subsequent technical guidelines should cover. So we want to get into definitions around do we need separate guidelines for technology types? Do we need separate guidelines for the regulated connection types, basic, standard, negotiated, registered, based on the rules definitions? Do we need separate guidelines based on connection level or voltage level, or should we base the guidelines on system size? So even this question around how the guidelines should be structured is not yet answered, and that's part of the framework stage that we're entering in now. The framework and principles guideline will also state what requirements the technical guidelines cover. So we'll go into, should the technical guidelines cover protection, power quality, metering, etc. What are the technical categories? Part of what's important going forward is that all of the documents look the same in terms of all the NSPs have, network service providers have documents that are structured in similar ways, cover the same topics, and so they are more easily navigable by proponents, because that has been made as a key issue. The framework and principles guideline will also specify what the technical, how the technical requirements should be specified. Should we specify the exact plants and equipment that should be provided, or should we base them on performance, or should we even allow networks to set them independently? But what is the way in which the network should go about setting those technical guidelines? So I guess if we go down the path of specifying plant and equipment, that will be highly specific, that perhaps the manufacturers of this equipment would prefer, but network service providers are more likely to prefer potentially less specific, more performance-based requirements. So we'll be engaging to determine how we are going to specify the precise technical requirements. And I guess that leads into what level of detail do we need to go to. We want to achieve consensus is the most important objective, so we need to achieve consensus, but if in doing so, does that mean we have to trade off in terms of how much detail we're able to go into in the technical requirements? So that's the framework and principles. The technical guidelines, I think I've covered most of this, but the technical guidelines themselves, we don't know how many there will be yet. That will be specified in the framework part, but in the technical guidelines we'll need to identify at what level of detail we go to. And again, I wanted to highlight that trade-off of consensus and technical specificity. So technical guidelines will be starting once the framework finished in early or mid, so early to mid next year. This is our timeframe and milestones, and that's a little bit small, so apologies for that. But I guess the stage one is the timeframe that you see on the top, and that's the framework and principles guidelines. So we are in the review stage where we're trying to understand stakeholders' perspectives on how the guidelines should be structured. We've commenced the survey of networks to understand how they're currently going about setting their technical guidelines and how they see that changing in the future. Then the draft guideline will go through a series of an engagement. We have a steering committee established that we'll report to, and that will happen in January, in early February next year. Then following that, the draft guideline prepared, and then there'll be another steering committee meeting and a webinar that occurs in March next year. So that the early March next year will be the next chance for us as the stakeholders here to meet back again and test the draft framework and principles guideline that we've developed. And then the second timeframe you can see there is around the first technical guideline. And again, we don't know at this stage what type of connection that will relate to. I think initial thoughts is that it should probably be the larger scale, the high voltage type connections, because as an industry, I think that's where we're seeing the need is emerging now in terms of whether the largest number of issues are occurring. So it may be, but that is the first guideline that occurs, and we'll be commencing that in April. We have got a gateway review phase in May, because at that point we'll determine whether we should be now producing all the guidelines in parallel, or whether we should just do them one at a time, and that's what that gateway review will determine, whether it's worth producing them all at once or just one at a time. You can see there that there's a MSP workshop phase as well. So with the technical guidelines, we will be doing a bit of a roadshow to all these states to engage on the detailed technical requirements. It's at that stage we think we'll need to speak with those within network organisations who have the most knowledge around the technical requirements, and potentially they'll be the largest barriers to achieving that consensus. So there'll be a bit of a roadshow presenting those in late May and early June, with the draft technical guideline produced after that in August. And whether that's just one or whether that's all of them, if it's all of them, it may push to later in the year. But at the very least, we'll have the first guideline produced in draft in August next year. And then to engage on that, we're in the test phase. We'll be having a face-to-face workshop with all stakeholders in one capital city, where again you'll be invited back to hear on the first technical guideline. I just saw a question come up that said Western Power should be involved in the NSP workshop, and that's an oversight, because they are actually involved, and we have included that in the scope. It just hasn't appeared on that table. So apologies, Western Power. Western Australia is definitely included in this process, and there will be a Western Australian workshop as well. Okay, so how to get involved? We'll be engaging with the MSPs primarily in this first phase. There's some surveys that have already gone out to them, as well as key industry stakeholders. In terms of proponents, we are using the Clean Energy Council as our main interface with proponents. So if there are proponents on the line and you want to have your views heard, then our preference is to contact the Clean Energy Council as your industry body, and they will then give the feedback to us via that mechanism. Like I said, there's a survey that's been sent out to network service providers that will also go to some other key stakeholders and industry bodies. So that is the chance to your industry bodies to have your say at this stage, and then there will be open invite webinars across the project. I have a few tables now that just go through the precise engagement touch points. So I will quickly cover those. The Framework and Principles Survey is an online survey which was sent out last week to NSP's governments and bodies, and we're starting to collect inputs on how the Framework and Principles guidelines should be constructed. We have our webinar today. Then our steering committees will commence, and on the steering committees we have representatives from the NSP, the Clean Energy Council, and AEMC as well. The Framework and Principles Guideline webinar, the next open invite webinar will be in early March 2018. Then the engagement approach on the technical guidelines, again, we have an online survey. We'll engage NSPs to understand how they see the technical requirements for each connection type being set, a steering committee meeting, then the NSP workshops that are state-based, including a Western Australian workshop in late May 2018. That will be followed by a combined NSP workshop where we'll be presenting our way forward, another steering committee following that, and then as well as key stakeholder meetings. And the final workshop, we're anticipating that will be in late August 2018, where we'll be presenting the first technical guidelines. Okay, so I think that's all for me. Stuart, I'll hand back to you to start the question section.
Yeah, so I suppose, thank you very much for that, Melanie. It was a great overview of where we're up to, and I suppose the next, what we want to spend the rest of the time is actually answering people's questions. So if more questions come up, that'll be great, and it's answering the questions that we've already got in the system. So just trying to give some insight. One is to answer any things that are any issues that are there, but also to try and if there's anything we haven't considered or we need to consider, or that you think could be important for us at this stage. So I'll just start going through the questions, and I'll probably sort of farm some of those out. So the first one I'm going to give to you, Melanie. The first one is, what about differences between export and non-export EG connections?
So I guess in terms of there may be technical requirements that differ between those two types of connections, and that's something we're looking to establish in the framework and principle guideline as to whether we need to produce separate guidelines for those two different circumstances, whether there's a need to have completely standalone guidelines, whether they can be addressed in the same guideline. But in general, I think the way we're thinking about it at the moment is that well, probably there won't be, although it will be reflected within an individual guideline in terms of how the requirements might change between export and non-export. They won't necessarily be standalone guidelines, but I guess that's still up for grabs in terms of how stakeholders see the structure of these guidelines playing out. But certainly the technical requirements would differ between those two circumstances.
And I think that goes to the next question as well, which is Western Australia has technical rules which are different from the NER, and the same sort of thing. So the whole idea is to try and get as much commonality as we can across the board. However, where there are issues, like from a Western Australian perspective, then we'd actually reflect those within the guideline as well. So to make sure that those things are actually captured.
Yeah, I think it's important that sorry, Stuart, it's important that these guidelines don't cause problems for the NSPs and aren't restrictive. Some of the feedback we've heard already is that this timeline that we've presented today is too long for some of the NSPs. They have issues now in terms of the technical requirements that they want to get sorted. And so this is why we're producing the framework principles guideline now, which will set out a sort of structure that all NSPs can follow. And so then if NSPs need to move quickly and need to reflect their own jurisdictional requirements, they are able to do so, but they can still reflect that within the same structure and format that's prescribed by the framework and principles guideline.
Yeah. The next question is, says, given the importance of this matter, particularly to enabling the required energy transformation, will the ENA be undertaking a full consultation, including publishing draft guidelines and standards and seeking feedback before proceeding in final documents? The answer is yes on that one. The whole idea is for actually developing these is to actually do this with full consultation with the key stakeholders that are out there, and to actually make sure that we actually get comments back on some of the draft guidelines, making sure that we actually take those on board before we actually proceed to finalising and publishing those documents. The next comment comes from who have and will these surveys be sent to within the DNSP businesses. What I've done is actually sent the survey to your asset manager, so who's actually on the ENA Asset Management Committee, and asked him, and we've actually explained to him who he should actually get to, or him or her, sorry, I should say, to actually fill out those surveys, and they will be delegating those to the appropriate person within your business.
Yeah, so one more comment on that, that we have two surveys out at the moment. One is a framework principles survey, which is aimed more at, I guess, higher level in the organisation, at people with a strategic perspective who would like to comment on the objectives and the structure of the framework and the principles. We have a second survey out, which is collecting information on how the NSPs currently set their technical requirements, how they categorise connections, how they differentiate between the technical requirements between connections, and they have been sent to the same person but requested that it's forwarded to, I guess, the manager of connections or equivalent, somebody who understands the existing technical requirements. We're aiming to use that survey to select what's happening currently so that we have consistency already across the NSPs and we don't need to change anything, then we can make sure that we retain that. The next one, there was quite a few different questions in regard to workshops within WA, and I think that's just more of an oversight. The whole idea is how do we will be connecting with WA on this and making sure that we go through that, and also we'll keep you informed on that stage. The other one was the stage 2 was missing an engagement workshops with generator proponents. And again, the whole idea is that we will be engaging with the generators, proponents. It's very important we do. It's probably what we, I think we haven't actually articulated exactly when and how that's actually going to be done yet for stage 2, is because we don't know how much of value we've actually got out of stage 1 yet. So we haven't actually crystallised exactly all the detail of what's going, or how we actually go about stage 2. But yes, once we actually get to that stage, we will be engaging with the generator proponents as part of that going forward. The CEC will also sit on the steering committee as well, so there'll be opportunities through that mechanism for generator proponents to engage. And we'll be using them to actually work out how that engagement will take place. So it could be we have a specific one, or it could come to some of the meetings or committees that you have within the CEC structure. And also for other organisations as well, we can do the same sort of thing. Has the ENA considered at what point the desire to achieve consensus is at odds with other objectives, such as lowest achievable cost to customers to connect, and what will ENA do if this conflict is crystallised? The whole idea of these guidelines is to try and one is make it easier, and two, lower hopefully to lower cost to the as much as possible, to try and take some of the onerous requirements out of this, and to try and standardise and make it easier. Yes, there is a potential in places that we could, in doing some of this, we could actually add some new requirements, because we are looking at how we could also use this process to actually get the information required for, say, the battery storage register that's been proposed by the federal government. However,
by looking at those and actually adding those, that should actually then streamline other processes across the board. So it may be that makes it, there's a little bit more that you'll have to do within the connection or more information you may need to put into that, but it'll actually mean there's not a duplication of process somewhere else, so you don't have to collect the information twice. So the whole idea is to try and streamline as much as possible this process, the connection process, but also how can we actually utilise this to actually meet some other requirements out there as well.
Yeah, and I think there certainly is the potential, if achieving the consensus is the main objective, that there is the potential to end up taking a lowest common denominator point. But the only way we can achieve consensus is we set the technical requirements so high so all the NSPs can agree. And I guess we are very much trying to avoid that potential outcome. One of the reasons that Cutler is engaged in this process is to, I guess, cast an independent eye over the technical requirements that the NSPs are putting up and making sure there's a risk-based approach to setting those technical requirements, balancing the need, I guess, for the NSPs to make sure that they have a safe, secure, reliable network against the need for proponents in the industry at large to deliver an efficient outcome is something that we're very aware of and something that will need to be balanced through this process. So yes, it's a challenge and we're well aware that may occur, and I guess it's through this process of stakeholder engagement and independence in terms of testing those technical requirements and what they mean from a risk perspective is something that we're trying to insert into this process.
The next one is, when you say registered generation, does this mean sub-transmission networks? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I was going to say that's, I suppose I would just be definitive on that one. So yes. In terms of the next question, which was how would storage be considered? This is actually an interesting one, and we're hoping the steering committee can assist us. We were initially thinking that we would have particularly for large-scale storage, grid-connected storage, that we would look at having a separate guideline for that. However, for other components where you're actually going to have storage with some sort of DR in parallel, then we actually thought that they should actually be addressed as part within these guidelines themselves. So the whole idea of storage will actually be addressed in each of the guidelines from an individual base, but we may also be looking at having another one. But that will be something that we'll look at as part of the scoping for the framework, and when we're doing that work, and also potentially and talking that through with the steering committee. What's the next one? Have you considered how a difference is the network's operating voltage is expected to be handled by the guidelines? Going on to Melanie for that one.
I think this is something that we'll need to resolve when we're developing the technical requirements. One of the proposals is that the technical guidelines are separated in terms of the voltage level of connection, so maybe that we have an HV, MV, LV, and looking as to whether that is going to give sufficient, I guess, differentiation between the different networks and how they and their operational characteristics. So I guess at the moment we don't know is the answer to that. Part of the solution will be making sure that these guidelines are sufficiently defined, in terms of we may have an HV, MV, LV, and whether that's going to be enough to be able to accommodate those differences. The other potential solution is in having these guidelines will then produce more of a template type approach in terms of this is what they should include, this is how you should set your technical requirements, that may fall short of setting the technical requirements themselves, and then the network could then set the technical requirements specific to their own circumstances. So we don't know at this point where the technical requirements will sit, how much we'll leave up to the NSPs, whether we're going to have to leave a lot up to the NSPs because of their unique characteristics such as operating voltages. But I guess we're trying to specify as much as we can, but still leave room for those differences to come through to a template type approach. So I don't know at this stage, but certainly that issue is there that we're looking to address.
Yeah, and I'd say that it could end up being that it may be because of the network requirements that it is different. However, how they're actually or approaching that question around voltage would be exactly the same way. It's just that it might be their requirements would be slightly different within the guideline that they'd actually be producing for their own network out of the template. I have got a question here around are we considering including consultants to get inputs regarding the technical and practical issues. The whole idea of having this webinar and other open workshops throughout the process and other webinars as well will be to make sure that we're actually, one is consulting or getting information out in terms of what we're doing on this, but also getting feedback. And it's important, and then getting feedback not just from network companies, but and also from proponents, but it's also other people that are actually working in this area as well. So yes, we would be looking at any input from consultants who help or assist in putting these together would be very useful. It also seems that, I've got the next question, it seems that there may be some diversion and views between NSPs on this. ENA confident that these guidelines will resolve this division. I can honestly say, I'd say yes. Obviously there is going to be probably some robust discussions in this area, but it has been recognised by the industry that this has been an issue and it's a sticking point for us. And that's why this was actually picked up as a key flagship project. So the CEOs and to that level of the organisations actually identified that they wanted to solve this issue and make sure it was actually we could actually resolve this and actually come up with these standardised guidelines and come up with a win. So I think there's probably going to be some hard discussions. I think there's going to be some things like that, but I think we will get there, yes. The next one is the first set of guidelines will be for 200 kilowatt systems. What would guidelines for the 10 kilowatts residential systems be? When will those 10 kilowatt residential systems be developed? We're probably looking at the second half of next year. So the whole idea is to get to help us meet the the short-term requirements. We're actually going to try and get this framework document out first, at the high-level framework. So that means people can actually look at, so members or networks can actually start looking at standardising their processes a little bit now and fixing up their current processes. But we're looking at having the final guideline in this area finalised towards probably somewhere around October, November this year. In 2018. The whole idea is we're going to be staggering these. So the first of all is to have obviously the framework out first early next year, then followed by the first of the guideline, and there'll probably be, because there's going to be so much consternation around that, we'll probably do a little bit more in depth in terms of that, engaging and working out some of the issues around that, but getting that one out around the end of May, early June. And then the others will be staggered after that. So we probably start those in parallel, but the whole idea is we'll actually get those out as the year progresses. So in the second half of the year. But the aim is to have them all completed by the end of December next year. I was going to say, is the process open to very streamlined processes and innovative approaches for small-scale DERs? I'll hand that one over. Look, from my perspective, I would say it is. The whole idea is we're open to trying to facilitate the best way to connect some of these into the system. However, I don't know if we can take everything in there, but I'm assuming people are thinking there about could we actually go to online platforms for the actual connection process, or looking at things like tablet apps and things like that. Probably in the short term, no, because these are actually the guidelines that actually go that. But the whole idea could be that could then be actually then utilised for the development of potentially more innovative ways of actually of allowing that process to be enacted.
I think
Melanie, you've got any thoughts on that?
an objective of these of the technical requirements, where we can streamline them as much as possible, it should aid the NSPs in streamlining their processes. So if we have technical requirements that are agreed to across the industry, and a proponent applying for a connection agreement is able to meet those requirements, then it does open up the NSP to the ability to streamline or automate that connection process, as many of them are already doing with the basic connections, the very small scale connections, that because those requirements are now becoming more and more standardised, that automation is already starting to happen in that area. And I think as we streamline more and more technical requirements, the potential for greater streamlining and automation is high.
All right, the next one is around how does this work link into some of the draft guidelines that AEMO have recently proposed, and is this exercise duplicating or leveraging any of that? I'll actually say the second is actually leveraging. We have met with, or had discussions with Audrey Zibelman around this, and the whole idea of this work is not to actually duplicate that, but it's actually to work in with that to see how we actually complement each other, and to make sure that there's a synergy between the two bits of work. Again, AEMO have been asked to actually be part of the steering committee for this work.
And I don't think we're going to be looking at the generator performance standards in terms of trying to affect that process or change those generator performance standards. We'll simply look to adopt them. But there are some technical requirements beyond those that we may pick up in terms of the network technical studies and what's actually being achieved to try and streamline some of that. It's sort of a mix between technical and process type issues that aren't covered by the generator performance standards. So we think there's a few areas outside of that could be addressed by the technical requirements, but certainly not looking to duplicate that exercise. I'll leave that to AMC and AEMO.
Yeah. The next question comes around about international standards or guidelines that are out there, or are we just looking at? So are we looking at reviewing something, the things that are out there on the international stage, or are we just continuing just to look at it from an Australian perspective? As part of the work, we will be looking. Obviously, there are things that are the work. We will be looking. Obviously, there are things that are specific to Australia, but there are some international standards and/or guidelines that have actually been developed. And I'm also aware of a project in the UK from ENA UK who's doing something similar to this at the moment. But there's also a guideline in Germany that is actually quite useful and could have some usefulness. And so yes, we will be looking at some of those. I wouldn't say it'll be exhaustive, but it will be trying to pick up the ones which will be most relevant for an Australian perspective. I was going to say the next one is from, we are now often having a situation where there are two or more generators, 5 megawatts that are have applied to be on weaker regional networks. There appears to be no driver for EMO and NSPs to do anything to create a solution for all customers. Will these guidelines help this more frequent issue? I was going to say no, because these are around the actual facilitating the connection. I will say there is other work that we are doing with the roadmap that will actually that we are looking at that will help facilitate those sort of issues in terms of what we need to do at the bottom end of the system to try and help out with in part of the weaker regional parts of the networks. So this won't specifically go to that, but I will say there are other roadmap flagship issues that are addressing that, and I'm happy to talk to that separately outside of this webinar if someone wants to contact me regarding that.
Yeah, I think in terms of opportunities for networks to invest in strengthening those networks, that's not something we're looking at, and that's being dealt with outside of this project. But one thing we may touch on, and it depends on the feedback we get, is in terms of the queuing policies that NSPs are applying for for connections. So where you had 2 applications for the same location on the network, how is capacity reserved for one or the other? Is it first come, first served, or how do NSPs generally go about that? Because it is being done differently at the moment. So we are looking at that and whether that's something that could be streamlined as well as part of this process. But I'm still not sure whether that will be included or not, but we've asked the question through the survey as to whether that's appropriate within this guideline.
The next question was, how can industry participants get draft publications for comment other than through the DSPs? Again, the whole idea is we've got people who are registered for this webinar, so obviously we'll be using that as a bit of a distribution list as things go forward through this process, but we'll actually be sending any correspondence we've got out to key stakeholders and also people that just are registered interested in the places in the process. We'll also be putting any of the draft documents for comment up on our website, so this is the Energy Networks Australia website, and we will probably be putting out e-blasts around that to actually tell people that they're actually there and we want comments on those. And we'll probably also, if we're actually putting something like that, we may have also had maybe a webinar or something like that to go with it to announce that that's there. The other way is you just make sure that you just keep looking at the website and making sure that we'll be posting it and doing some other issues around that as well. There also could potentially be, we'll maybe putting out some media releases around some of those as well.
And the open invite webinars will be held at draft stage of all the publications, and so we'll be presenting the main outcomes at those as well for comments.
Yeah, and again, anybody who registers for those would then be put on the email list for sending out the document too. Tom has asked for, is Northern Territory included? Yes.
Yes, I think they're on there on the schedule, but they're definitely included.
Yes. Next one is, will it be possible to consider technology types which do not require grid connection approval, i.e. only need to inform DNSPs after installation has occurred? We haven't looked at that issue in detail yet as part of the scoping of this. It will probably be something that will actually be raised with the steering committee to see if we want to go down that path and actually include those. It could be of use to do that because going forward, I think there is it could be useful, but I think that's something we'll have to explore in more detail as we start looking at what's in and out of the guidelines. The next question is, can you clarify this project is targeted mainly at DNSP connected generators, as using the term NSP can be either? This was actually, so it's probably going to be primarily for the DNSPs. However, for some of the HV connections, we are looking at doing this for transmission and sub-transmission guys as well.
I think in terms of previous studies and where the main issues have been identified, it has been at distribution level. And so I guess as part of this initial stage, we're looking at, well, do we just focus on the problem areas and is that the sort of negotiated connections at distribution level, or is there benefit in this being a complete from the very smallest with no export right up to the largest? Is that the better way to go about that? So we're forming opinions about through this survey and initial process, but at least at this stage that we're open to considering transmission connections as well.
And I think this comes from the two questions that's similar. One is, who is represented on the steering committee, and will regulatory bodies be consulted? The idea is both AEMO and the AEMC will be on the steering committee, and in terms of jurisdictional regulators, we will be consulting with them quite closely because of some of the jurisdictional requirements that are around there. So we need to make sure that we're heavily consult on that. Outside of those sort of bodies, we are looking at also having, obviously, the Department of Energy, Environment and Energy at the federal level on this, but also people like Energy Consumers Australia, potentially PAC, potentially obviously the Clean Energy Council and some proponents out of the Clean Energy Council. We haven't actually finalised that yet, but they're the sort of organisations that are going to be represented on that group. The whole idea is we're going to be trying to finalise the steering committee and have the first meeting of that towards the end of January next year. This one's got Telstra Energy is trying to connect over 100 sites with more than 1,000 megawatts in almost every distribution region. We have unrivaled experience in this space, but are not part of the CEC. How are we reaching out beyond the CEC? Again, it's through what we're doing today. It's how we're engaging with some of the other key stakeholders, and then making sure that they're aware of that, and so they can then get in touch with us and actually make sure they're actually part of that consultation process, and then get invited to if we have webinars and workshops on some of these different issues. So we'd be very happy to have Telstra Energy come along to those components and make sure that they're actually included going forward. How will these guidelines interact with our standard stream of work? The standards work that we're actually doing is more around some of the technical standards that are an issue for us at the moment, particularly in the areas of things like cyber security, for things like that, interoperability, communications, data management, etc., where we've got some issues in our industry at the moment. And so there's some of the things we're really focusing on in those areas, control systems, etc. Those sort of issues that come out of those, though, however, the whole idea is could then feed into these guidelines going forward. Any requirements that come out of those, and at the moment they'll be interacting with the current standards, but any future standards that we actually produce, or ones we're actually revising standards, those issues will then be addressed as part of how we actually. This won't be a one-off. The whole idea is this guideline will be updated on a regular basis to make sure that it stays relevant and stays up to date, and which will be the same with our members as well. They would then be looking at the guidelines they produce for each of the NSPs, would then be making sure that they're keeping theirs up to date as those standards change. While called a guideline, will the requirements be mandated, so to speak, for connection? At the moment, it's an interesting question, this one. It was looked at as part of some of the other studies that came before this, and will we actually go down that path? At this stage, it's not looking at doing that, but the whole idea is it's like that in terms of the industry guidelines we do get the compliance by all of from a member's perspective is very high on using those national guidelines in terms of doing that, so they all have agreed to go down that path and actually utilise these and manage those. But it could be down the path that the guideline could be turned into a standard, but my problem with that would be that we'd want to make sure that these actually stay relevant, and we can, if we do need to change them or update them quickly, we wouldn't have to go through the process you do with if it's actually been turned to a standard.
And having been involved in the piece of work that looked at the different options for voluntary or standard, Australian Standard Code of Practice, one of the big benefits in a voluntary standard hosted by the ENA is that it could happen relatively quickly. The process of developing a standard and the time that it would take to agree on that would mean that some of the benefits would be lost, given that the importance of this now and the sorts of issues that are emerging now. It really isn't an urgent requirement, and the option of a voluntary will get us there sooner, with the potential to shift to a more mandated type approach in the future following where these are successful. They could be converted to either a code of practice or potentially even a standard further down the track.
Which then goes to similar to the next question, which was how frequently are the guidelines expected to be reviewed and what process for suggesting changes. So the whole idea will be for these, we would be looking at probably a 2-yearly review. However, if something happened that was significant in between, then that could actually trigger off a earlier review on the process to make sure that was taken into account. so the whole idea is make sure that they're happening on a regular basis. So to be on a 2-yearly basis, but could go to an as needs if something significant happened in that period. And in terms of suggesting changes, the whole idea is, again, through this process, and we're connecting with all these new stakeholders as part of this, would be that you would stay in contact and as part of that group, and so that you could actually come back to the ENA and get in contact with myself to actually suggest some of those any possible changes you may consider we may want to look at going forward, because that would then go back to the steering group, would actually then go back and keeping that group going, making sure we're actually, as part of that review process, it wouldn't just be the NSPs that would be doing the national guideline. I'd actually be getting some externals to come along to as part of that too. So we'd be looking at some of the proposals that come in from people to actually review and make sure that was that suggestion worthwhile looking at, and if it was, then how do we actually take that forward? The next one is, have we considered whether these guidelines will create a more expedited connection process? Will it reduce risk for proponents by clarifying requirements? That is the whole aim, or one of the 3 key aims of this piece of work, is to hopefully expedite that connection process in terms of making it easier and more straightforward process, and clarifying what they actually require to do. So a lot of some of the issues that have actually come around in terms of connection has been because there's been uncertainty about what they needed to do. They've put it in, and it's come back as being the wrong thing or the wrong issue. They've addressed it in the wrong way. The whole idea is hopefully this will assist in clarifying those requirements, which will actually mean it's you only need to put it in once, or it's a very it quickens up that process and going forward. It also could potentially. There is talk about how long it actually takes for a connection process to be evaluated, and that is something that's going to be discussed. I cannot say if that will be addressed or not, but it is something that will actually be looked at as part of some of the work we're doing. Are there expected to be large divisions between local standards, service and installation rules, and these guidelines, and how will the process manage this if so? I'm going to go back to Mel on this one. You can go first.
Yeah, I think there's certainly potential for that to occur, because there will be different local standards across different jurisdictions, and we have invited state governments to be part of this process as well. So we will be looking to understand their requirements, how they differ, and how the NSPs will need to, I guess, then adopt whatever goes in that guideline, how they'll then need to be then changed for the individual NSPs, and how we might manage that, whether it's through a template or whether it's through a higher level specification where the detail needs to change between NSPs. But that will be part of the exploration process in terms of how we manage those issues of inconsistency and conflict.
And I was going to say, just to go with that, I'll just concur, is the whole idea is if we can actually make, I understand why there are jurisdictional differences. It might be something that's actually completely reasonable and things like that, but it might actually help us actually ironing out some of those jurisdictional differences in places as well. So if this process can aid in some of those things to try and get more standardisation across the states in some of those issues, that would be good. But obviously that won't happen in all accounts. There are some issues that have to be addressed because for other reasons. I am cognizant of the time, and we haven't got through all the questions yet. It is just coming up to the end of the time period we had for the webinar. My thoughts would be that we would close the webinar now, but however, I don't want to lose any of the questions that we still haven't got to yet. So my thoughts there would be that we will record all of those, and actually all the ones we've actually gone through before. We'll try and address each of those, and some of them we'll group them together, put some answers together, and actually put that up on our website. I'll try to undertake and have that out by sometime next week. But if worse comes to worse, it'll be the first week of January when that can go up on our website. But the whole idea is so that any of those other questions we didn't get to as part of today's webinar, we do try and address for you and make sure that you've actually got those answers there. I'd like to thank you all for your participation and actually being part of today. And just by the questions and the interest that we've got through those, I can see that there's a lot of interest in the work we're trying to do here, and it looks like it'll be great. There'll be a lot of feedback and input, hopefully, that we'll get, because a lot of the time the worst thing we can actually do is not get that input and not get that feedback, and we end up going down a path which doesn't meet all the requirements that we want it to do. So thank you very much for participating and joining in, and feel free to contact either myself or Melanie going forward to ask any more questions you've got as well. Thank you very much, and goodbye.